All right, juniors, how's it going? So we got one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in U.S. history today, the Dred Scott decision, which in a nutshell is going to deny citizenship to black people in the United States, and it's going to claim that it is stuff like the Missouri Compromise, the federal banning of slavery in any territory is illegal. Okay. So bad news ruling, obviously. Okay. Dred Scott was a slave of an army surgeon named John Emerson. And John Emerson, of course, as being in the army, would be transferred from place to place. So he was originally in Missouri. He then went to posts in Illinois and then in Minnesota, a place called Fort Snelling. And he was up there in the 1830s. He was up there for a little while. While they were up in Minnesota at Fort Snelling, Dred Scott married another one of Emerson's slaves. And this itself was unusual because normally marriage would not be recognized among slaves by local authorities or by white people. But this one was, I believe, simply because they were in a free territory, a territory that had been made free by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Okay, so Scott and his wife give birth to a daughter who was born in free territory as they're on their way back to Missouri. So that's another thing here, is now they've got a daughter who was the daughter of slaves, but born in free territory, right? So is she free, right? Okay. Now, after Emerson dies, Dred Scott is inherited by the widow, the white widow, and then white friends of Dred Scott say, look, you lived in free territory for a really long time. There have been a number of court cases in Missouri in which slaves have been freed because they'd been taken into free territory, and then the courts had said, well, that if you lived long enough in those territories, you could be considered a free person. So Dred Scott then begins the suit in 1846, and then for the next 11 years, the suit is ongoing. So Dred Scott first loses the case, and I believe the case is for himself, his wife, and his daughter. At least himself and his wife. If they're free, then the daughter will be free, clearly, because she was born in free territory, right? And if they were free, she would be the daughter of free people. Okay, look, Scott loses, but then he appeals, and they win in a St. Louis County Court in 1850. Then it goes up to the Missouri Supreme Court, and they overruled the St. Louis County Court ruling, and that is in 1852. So the Supreme Court of Missouri ruled against Dred Scott, saying he had to be a slave. When they did that, they were overturning precedent. They were not going according to what the earlier Missouri courts had ruled, which said that if you were an enslaved person living long enough in a free territory, you could be considered free. Why are they overturning precedent? Because in 1852, you're just a couple of years after the Compromise of 1850, that moment when the U.S. almost broke out into civil war, there's all sorts of pressure on the courts from Southerners and from pro-slavery Missourians. We saw what they did, some of them in Kansas, right? Nothing against Missourians, but they, you know, there's bad, people make bad choices in every state. Okay, look, so, yeah, look, 1852, there's a lot of pressure to overturn the rulings and to use the courts to protect slavery. That was the thing that the Southerners wanted the courts to do. Okay, now, okay, so they failed in the state courts. So the next option, Dred Scott's lawyer says, to take this thing to federal courts. Now, they were able to do this. Normally, you couldn't, but they were able to do this because Dred Scott's owner had moved to New York. And so if you had two citizens in different states, there was a rule that said that you could appeal to federal court, that a federal court would have jurisdiction in that case. So they appealed to federal court, and the Federal Circuit Court, that's one of the federal courts around the country, but one of them in Missouri in 1854, again rules against Dred Scott. So he loses again. So they finally appealed then in 1854, after they lose, at the lower federal level, to the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, now finally we get to the U.S. Supreme Court. and there's a Southern majority with regard to the justices on the U.S. Supreme Court in 1854. So the justices first hear the case in 1855 and 1856. They then schedule it to be heard again in the following year. Arguments are heard again in 1856 and 1857. Okay, so right at the time as the whole crisis in Kansas is unfolding, this case regarding Dred Scott is starting to gain national attention. And so, of course, particularly from abolitionists and from the pro-slavery radicals. Okay, so there were three main questions. Look, anyone who's pro-slavery is like, just, no. Radical, look, I'm not going to give you a lecture on this, but who was it that said this? And if you're radical for something that's good, that's okay. And I don't necessarily agree with whoever said, but that's, yeah, you would be radical for good things, okay? So, pro-slavery, anyway, I don't know what I'm talking about. Look, there was we all agree here on this. So, the pro-slavery faction, I'm just calling radical, okay? But it's not a denigration of the word radical in general, that's all I'm saying. Okay, that was a strange digression, it's quite late. Okay, so the three questions that the Supreme Court is dealing with here. Number one, did Dred Scott, as a black man, have a right to sue in federal courts? That's number one. The earlier courts had all ruled only on that question and thrown it out and said no, because he was an enslaved person and a black man, he didn't have a right to sue in court. We don't have to hear the case. They had thrown it out. Okay, but that was number one question. Number two question was, did the actual substance, did a prolonged residence in a free territory give Dred Scott freedom? And number three, was Fort Snelling actually a free territory? That is, the real question there is, was the Missouri Compromise of 1820 legal? Was it constitutional? Those are the three questions. Now, the Supreme Court might have simply ruled on the first question, said Dred Scott doesn't have a right to sue in court. We're going to throw the case out. However, Chief Justice Roger Taney decides he's going to rule on all three questions. And Chief Justice Roger Taney is a Southerner. He is a, he had owned slaves, but he had freed them. But his whole thing was that slavery was central and integral to the Southern way of life, as he understood it, and the Southern way of life he wanted to protect or whatever. Okay. So he's going to use this as an opportunity to make a statement and to use the federal courts to protect slavery and to side with the pro-slavery faction here. Now, all right, Roger Taney is also being pressured by politicians to do this because all this controversy about the Compromise of 1850, about what's going to happen with slavery in the West, particularly in Kansas and Nebraska, all of this controversy, right? The politicians would like, especially the pro-slavery politicians, would like the courts to come in and say that, look, the Congress cannot prohibit slavery anywhere. Therefore, no more laws prohibiting slavery in the West at all. No more federal laws prohibiting slavery. Okay, that's really what the Southerners want. So again, here we are with the Southerners favoring big federal government. Again, they want the federal government to come in. Well, okay, that's not fair. In this case, they want a statement saying the federal government cannot make laws of any kind regarding slavery. Okay, that's a little bit different. All right, whatever. All right, but there is also the possibility that this case has of opening up an increase in federal power, which I'll mention in a moment. Okay, so Taney comes out on all three questions. With regard to whether Dred Scott can sue in court, he says no, he's a black man, and he goes off on this bizarro racist tangent about, and also, he also says that the founding Constitution was never meant to apply to black people, whether they were free or enslaved. It doesn't matter if you're the descendant of a free or enslaved person. The Constitution does not protect you if you're a black person. That's what Taney says. And, therefore, not only do you not have a right to appear in court, you cannot be a citizen ever if you're a black person. That's what he says. And that the phrase, all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence, he actually says, was not meant to include black people. Okay. So, all right. And, never were black people to be protected by the Constitution or have political rights. Okay, problem. Okay, so this was clearly wrong if you look, at any history. Now, first of all, there's dissents to this from these two justices, Curtis and McLean. And they point out that, free black people in 1788 had a lot of legal rights, including the right to hold and bequeath property, make contracts, and other things. Okay, so the arguments are easily refuted. Okay, but it doesn't shut Taney down. Beyond this, in 5 of the 13 states that ratified the original Constitution, black men could vote. Okay, but Taney said those were like state prerogatives and didn't, had nothing to do with the federal government. And then Taney goes on to say that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, that the federal government had no right to make a ruling about where slavery could be said to be illegal. Okay, and then the critique of Curtis and McLean, the dissents, come back and say, well, actually, what do you call the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which forbade slavery in the Northwest Territory then, because that was already there before the Constitution. So the arguments that Taney makes are historically easy to debunk, and of course morally horrendous. All right, now the consequences of all this are pretty severe. So of course Scott says he has to remain a slave, but the point of Taney here, and what the Southerners want, is they want to be able to take their slaves into another state and not have anybody say anything about it and not be challenged in any way. Okay, and you have Abraham Lincoln, of course, one of the leading Republicans at this point, when the ruling comes out in 1857, saying that this is going to open the door for overturning any state law forbidding slavery. So first of all, in point of fact, slavery is not going to be illegal anywhere, because slave owners can take their slaves into any state and they remain slaves. And there's nothing anybody can do about it according to this law. Number two, in terms of the law itself, it could bring into question, if there is a constitutional protection for slavery at the federal level, it could bring into question, Lincoln says, the right of any state to make laws prohibiting slavery. Okay, so again, you see how the Southerners and their support, or the pro-slavery Southerners and their support for slavery, there's always a way, first of all, the point here is the Southerners will often say that it's about the states' rights, but I just don't buy it. I just do not buy it, okay? I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. I don't buy it, because here again, Lincoln, I think he's right. He's saying this could open the door to a federal prohibition of state laws against slavery. Okay, so it's a big deal, Dred Scott, and it's a horrible thing, but here it is, and that's what we got for today. All right? All right, be good. All right.